Nellie is going to introduce our program for the evening. Nellie Johnson.
All right. Hello, I'm Nellie Johnson. Nice to be here. I'm going to go back to the early 1980s. I was at the Pearl Road Junkyard, and they had band. Daniel Thompson, who everyone here knows, was giving out his poetry. And there was this little red-headed man, and his wife, and they had a little TV set, and they were showing pictures of how little baby chicks were being debeaked. 5 at a time. They're in the machine onto the hot plate without any anesthesia. Next 5 chicks being debeaked. And this red-headed man was trying to show the world what was going on. And I started my trip on veganism. So I would like, 30 years go by. I'm in a vegan activist room. I see a red-haired man. I go, hey, oh my God. We ran into each other and recognized each other. So I introduce to you my friend, longtime vegan activist, and co-founder of the Cleveland Vegan Society, Jack McMillan.
Thanks, Nellie. I better turn this on. Should I use the microphone, do you think?
Yes.
Okay, all right, I'll use it. Hello? Okay. All right. Really, thanks a lot, Nellie. That's a good story, pretty cool story. And it gave me a lift after 30 years, to meet someone who I had actually influenced 30 years earlier. I mean, that really gave me a lift. And I think you all know, it's the same for all of you, that when you're doing your activism, you never know who you're reaching. You just never know, but you must know that you're planting the seeds of change. Is the microphone loud enough? Okay, all right. Anyway, thanks for having us speak today on something that may at first blush seem irrelevant and inconsequential to peace on Earth. But first I want to commend all of you with Cleveland Peace Action and the rest of you here, because some of you are just John Q. Public, I suppose. But you're not John Q. Public. You all care very deeply about peace and justice and ending wars. And if it wasn't for you, there would be no one speaking about these issues. So I want to commend Cleveland Peace Action and the rest of you for all the work that you do. Anyway, Nellie, that's a funny story, about us, and we really do get a kick out of recounting it. But it's actually kind of a sad story, at least for me. I've been working on environmental and animal rights issues for over 45 years. And to be honest, except for a few changes, a few victories here and there, I really feel like we've gotten almost nowhere. And actually, almost every issue that at least I was working on, and I think you must feel the same way, it's even worse today than it was 30 years ago, 20 years ago. We just can't seem to make enough progress. We've been trying to end wars for centuries and eons now. And in our country alone, it's been at war for 236 of its 243-year history. Only 7 years in the entire history of the United States have we not been at war. Oh, gotta get my foot in here. Thoreau said, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." In my own activism work, it wasn't until about 9 years ago that I realized all I was doing was really hacking away at the branches. And that's like pruning a bush. It just helps the branches keep growing. That's good for bushes, but it's bad for the issues that we're working on. They just keep growing. And that's exactly what has happened in the decades since I began my activism. 9 years ago, I discovered something that was there all along, but I never really took heed of. I was vegetarian and mostly vegan, at least dietarily. But in my animal rights activism, I jumped from one single issue to another, flailing away at this issue and that issue. And like I said, well, I won't go back into that. I sometimes was able to get people to see the wrongness of one form of abuse, like the steel jaw leg hold trap, which is one issue that I worked on for quite a while, only to see that those same people had no problem with eating animals or with some other form of animal exploitation. And those same people might have no problem supporting environmentally destructive practices, or would be supporters of our absurd wars around the world, or at least indifferent to them. Rather than struggle to talk people out of this or that issue I was working on, I thought there must be an underlying principle that would inform us across the board to answer what is right and what is wrong regarding our use and treatment of animals and our injustices towards humans. That's when I discovered that there was such an overarching principle, and it was the concept of veganism. And I discovered that that concept, when really taken to heart, informs our treatment of humans as well. The same mentality is at the root of both. Now, I'm not saying that we should stop fighting against this or that issue of injustice. We have to. We have no choice. And it's critically important work that you do with Cleveland Peace Action and some of the issues that I continue to work on. But it's really so frustrating. We feel like we're pulling our hair out trying to stop the insanity. Trump gloats publicly about the passing of the largest military spending budget in the history of our country. And the country's not up in arms about it and protesting on the streets. And we wonder why. I mean, how can we reach people? That's insanity. I don't have an answer to that indifference. And yet veganism just might have somewhat of an answer, at least, and I think a big part of that answer. So I think it's important to look at the roots of oppression and how the meaning and practice of veganism helps us better understand the branches of injustice, and in fact gets us closer to hacking at the roots, both in theory and in practice. It is rightly said that one can't be a true environmentalist unless one is also vegan. As I will show later, animal agriculture is the single greatest driver of climate change. Likewise, I don't think one can be a true anti-war activist if one goes home to extreme violence on our plates every day. We can hack at a branch, but at the end of the day, we are feeding the roots of oppression. Veganism is simply the practice of being a conscientious objector to violence to any and all beings, and not just to humans. It extends our circle of compassion to our non-human fellow beings on Earth, and to Earth herself. And in so doing, it shows us how our failure to include fellow animals stems from the same flawed perspectives and worldviews that are at the root of our treatment of fellow humans. And that the same ideas and rationalizations used to justify the use and exploitation of non-human animals are used to rationalize and allow injustices to humans. So let's start with the definition of veganism and a little history. Veganism is a way of living, this is the formal definition, at least one of them. Veganism is a way of living which excludes all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to the animal kingdom, and includes a reverence and compassion for all life, and the key word is all here. It's a principle that man has no right to exploit the creatures for his own ends. Donald Watson is actually, in 1944, was the founder of the first vegan society in the UK. The concept has been around for thousands of years, though. Just as the concept of human peace has been around for thousands of years. Vegetarianism used to mean what veganism means now. But it became reduced to just a diet over the centuries, okay? Just a diet. And it got watered down to mean just no flesh, ignoring the horrors of dairy. Watson coined the term vegan to expand vegetarianism to include dairy and to establish veganism as an ethical principle of non-exploitation. Here's some quotes by Watson. Life, precious though it is not the only basic right which we deny the animals. Perhaps no less criminal is the deprivation of their freedom, their normal life, family life, their liberty to develop according to natural patterns of their inclination instead of the hideous plans we, in our greed for profits and taste, have outlined for them. But Watson also recognized that veganism was a human justice issue as well. And I quote, "Throughout history, whenever man had risen against cruelty and exploitation, he had benefited himself as well as those he had emancipated. Therefore, further advantage would follow if we seriously tackle those cruelties upon which civilization was so largely built. If the vegan ideal of non-exploitation were generally adopted, it would be the greatest peaceful revolution ever known, abolishing vast industries and establishing new ones in the better interests of man and animals alike." And I hope to demonstrate how we can be the greatest peaceful revolution in the history of our species. So veganism is not just about our abuse and treatment of animals. That's a branch, although it's a very huge branch. But there's something much more fundamental to it. And that's that we have no right to use animals for our own self-serving ends. Just as we have no right to use humans for our own ends and self-serving interests. But rationalizing our use of animals has paved the way for our rationalizing the use and abuse of humans. Tolstoy wrote, "As long as there are slaughterhouses, there will be battlefields." This isn't just a line of poetry, something really flowery. I mean, Tolstoy was a very smart man, and this is what he thought and wrote. And Pythagoras wrote, over 2,400 years ago, "As long as man continues to be the ruthless destroyer of other living beings, he will never know health or peace. For as long as men massacre animals, they will kill each other." And Albert Schweitzer said, "Until he extends the circle of his compassion to all living beings, man will not himself find peace." Now, these are statements from some very wise people, and they mean something. And the vegan principle speaks to what they're saying. Now let's look at the attitudes and belief systems that allow us to so horrifically treat our fellow animals. Our human consciousnesses are dominated by hierarchical thinking about the world. We say we believe in equality, but in our minds we really don't. We have a superiority complex. We have an arrogance that we are the best and the highest. And the rest of the animal kingdom and the earth herself is below us. To support that conceit, we create hierarchies of value. This allows us to objectify and commodify those perceived to be below us, and to exploit them to serve our selfish interests. This also allows us to pick and choose who we grant the status of personhood to. In our hearts, we know fellow animals are persons, but in our minds, we deny that, so that we can eat them and use them as we see fit. And we rely on rationalization and emotional disconnect to not have to face the truth of it. We otherize animals and we otherize the earth. Those who are others are not us. And we don't have to concern ourselves with those who are not us. And we don't have to concern ourselves with granting or giving empathy to them. This way of thinking in hierarchies of value is clearly the same mentality that we use in our perception and treatment of fellow humans. Superiority, concepts of superiority, our arrogance, concepts of objectification, commodification, otherization, rationalization, and emotional disconnect, they've all created in us a domination mentality that we've used for eons now in the human sphere. The result has been endless conflict, wars, and injustices heaped upon those we fail to grant empathy of full personhood to. And we know there are many examples of that. The Native Americans, blacks, the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong in Vietnam, you brought that up, or you will. How to get rid of this way of thinking? By practicing the opposite. By going vegan, we break the spell of hierarchical thinking that it has upon us. We may think that we can create a just world for humans in and of itself. But if we maintain our massive domination mentality toward other animal species, we will continue to dominate our own species. call it a law of the universe or something, but I think it's true. I know it's true. What goes around comes around. Okay, these are some of the underlying roots of oppression that are common to human and animal injustice. Let me move on to some of the more practical aspects about veganism. Gandhi said, the most violent weapon on earth is the table fork. There's an elephant in the room in the form of Gandhi's fork. There is one single industry that is the greatest driver of most of these issues, and it is an industry we can easily walk away from, with no sacrifice and only tremendous benefits to us in the world. That industry is animal agriculture. It is destroying our environment, our health, and is at the center of injustices throughout the world, both on a practical level and a spiritual level. And the good news is, all it takes is a simple dietary change, and this industry, and the mentality of exploitation and oppression that is at its root, and at the root of human injustice, will simply disappear. Most of you are serious environmentalists deeply concerned about climate change. But I want to show how we can't be true environmentalists unless we are also vegans. And before I go on, let me first clarify that animal agriculture includes the dairy industry. I know many of you here are vegetarian. Well, actually, I'm finding out that almost everybody here is vegan, and I'm talking to the choir here, but many of you, most of you here, whatever, are vegetarian. But dairy is every bit as environmentally destructive and every bit as horrific in terms of the animal exploitation it entails. Nellie's going to get more into that in her part of the talk. And it also includes the fish industry, just as destructive and horrible. And just to set the perspective from the get-go here, when we talk about animal agriculture, we are talking about 65 billion animals a year and several trillion marine animals every year that are slaughtered for our diet, for our taste buds. For the land animals alone, 180 million animals are slaughtered every single day. That's more animals every single day than were killed in World War I, World War II, and all of our wars since combined. We slaughter more land animals, 800 million, for food than all the humans that have been killed in all the wars in human history, which is 500 to 700 million. Animal agriculture is by far the most willful assault on life in the history of our planet. Anyway, back to the practical impacts of animal agriculture, which relate to so many social justice issues. Uppermost on our minds is climate change. So let's start there. Studies have shown that animal agriculture is the single greatest producer of greenhouse gases. At the low end, the conservative United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, called the title of the study was called Livestock's Long Shadow, revealed that animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of greenhouse gases. They pointed out that that is more than all forms of transportation in the world combined. All cars, planes, trucks, etc., which is only 14%. Other studies from independent sources less politically restrained, such as World Watch Institution's Livestock and Climate Change report, show that it is as much as 51%. But whether it is 18% or 51%, and let's take the middle ground of 34% here, animal agriculture is far and away the most significant factor in greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, the UN came out and declared that in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, the world needs to switch to a totally plant-based diet by 2030. There is 0% chance that we will convert to renewables in the next 10 years. But if we ditch animal agriculture, we can meet our emissions goals, and we can buy all the time we need to convert to our infrastructure to renewables. But climate change is just one aspect of a far greater and more encompassing problem we're facing. and that's global environmental depletion. And animal agriculture is the greatest driver of that too. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction in the history of the world of flora and fauna. It's not been seen in 65 million years. Global biodiversity loss is already at 50%, and it's caused by deforestation and habitat destruction and degradation. And animal agriculture is at the heart of it due to the massive amount of land it uses. Our rainforests are home to 50% of the world's flora and fauna species. 50% of the rainforests have been clear-cut already. 70 to 90% of that is for livestock, either for grazing or for growing feed crops for livestock, for cattle. That's an orangutan looking for his old home. Just wandering. It's a double-edged sword. Clear-cutting releases sequestered CO2 and destroys the very forest that absorbs CO2 and produces 25% of the world's oxygen. Livestock grazing and monoculture feed crops are also the leading cause of increasing desertification around the world. In the US, we have 1.9 billion acres in the lower 48. 788 million acres is given over to livestock grazing, and another 280 million acres is given over to growing feed crops for those livestock. Corn, animal grade, corn, soy, alfalfa, and wheat. That's a total of 1.1 billion acres devoted to animal agriculture. That's 58% of the land, of our land, given over to livestock at the sacrifice of natural biodiversity. And the rest of our land, only 6% is urban and rural residential. The remainder of the forest is, remainder of our land is forests and parks. But the most staggering statistic of all, only 3 million acres produces all the vegetables that we grow in this country. That's less than 1% of our land. And those amber waves of grain that you see when we're driving around the country, they're vast monoculture fields for livestock feed corn and animal grade soy, wheat, and alfalfa. All these with herbicides and pesticides, of course. And worldwide, 66% of our total arable land mass is devoted to livestock, either grazing or feed crops. 2 football fields of land feeds 2 people with the standard American diet. It can feed 14 people on a plant-based diet. And I think that's a conservative figure. The ratio is generally closer to 15 to 20 to 1 of the wastage from animal agriculture. 5 billion acres of land can be reforested if we switch to a plant-based diet. That's 2.5 continental United States. And this is what we can grow instead of that. Imagine the amount of real food we can grow using a fraction of that land, and reforest our earth with all that wasted land and restore Earth's biodiversity. And those forests would further mitigate climate change by absorbing more CO2. Plus all that methane and nitrous oxide that comes from animal agriculture just would never exist in the first place. Water, 70%. The United Nations Environmental Program reports that 70% of our fresh water is used for animal agriculture. 800 million people suffer from clean water scarcity. Water wars are predicted to be our next major social crisis. I think we've heard about that. And it's all due to, primarily due to animal agriculture. It takes 2,800 gallons to produce a single pound of meat. 1,200 gallons to produce a gallon of milk. It takes just 119 gallons to produce a pound of potatoes, 100 gallons for a pound of edible grain, and just 6 to 30 gallons for carrots, blueberries, leafy greens, etc. And that water crisis in California, people are told to shower less. But household use is only 4% of Cleveland's water, 4% of California's water use. Meat and dairy consumes 45% of all of California's fresh water. One single Whopper burger consumes more water than not showering for a whole month. So I don't know about you, but I think it would be more justice to lose the Whopper burger and shower every day. And speaking of California, a new report just came out, I just read it yesterday, from Friends of the Earth, about monarchs in California. 86% of monarchs have died off since 1980. 86%. And in the 80s, there were 30 million monarchs migrating through California every year. And now it's down to 30,000. But the story goes on to blame Monsanto and glyphosates. But the blame is animal agriculture. The article never talked about that. You know, that all the pesticides and the chemicals, the pesticides, herbicides, and the eradication of the milkweed comes from our plowing all of California's land, given over to animal agriculture and lacing it with chemicals. Of course, there's runoff from animal agriculture. This is from some of the CAFOs that Nellie's going to mention. Extreme runoff. And in the United States, 35,000 miles of rivers in 22 states are polluted by runoff from animal agriculture. Topsoil. 33% of our agricultural topsoil has already been eroded away. And within 50 years, it will be all gone at this rate. And it's all due to animal agriculture, and it leads to desertification, which is a major issue around the world. And the culprit? Oceans. 70% of wild fish species are fully exploited and depleted in our oceans. By 2030, our oceans will be commercially extinct. And these are studies, I'm quoting facts and figures from studies, that are actually looking into these issues. By 2030, our oceans are going to be extinct. I mean, essentially extinct of commercial fishing. And there is a 20-to-1 ratio of bykill. That's 2 billion tons of marine life dragged out of the oceans every single year. So it actually amounts to 8 trillion marine beings that are killed yearly, yanked out of the ocean and suffocating on ship hulls, whatever you call them. We're literally clear-cutting our oceans, just like we clear-cut our forests. This is continental shelf where most of the fishing goes on because that's where most of our life is. Due to climate change, warming the oceans, phytoplankton are crashing, and they are crucial to the web of ocean life and the production of oxygen, because the oceans produce another 25% of our oxygen, or more. Whales and large marine animals are 90% depleted now, and they're critical to the web of life in the oceans. It's a looming biocrash of the web of life. The oceans are also acidifying due to climate change and pollution. They haven't been this acidic in 300 million years. It's destroying our coral reefs, and shells of shellfish are literally dissolving because the water is too acidic. Our oceans are so overfished that fish farms are now supplying 50% of all the fish that we consume. They are floating pig farms with all the same toxic runoff of the oceans. This is all driven by our habit of eating fish instead of plants. So it's really not the industry that's driving everything that I'm talking about. It's our diet. We support these industries. And the net result of our ocean fishing and our fish farms, this is by sea, and that's by land. This is underneath whatever water area that is being fish farmed. That's blood spewing forth from the fish farm processing part of it, the processing part of it. Paul Watson, you all know who Paul Watson is, founder of Sea Shepherd and the director of Sea Shepherd. He said, when the oceans die, we die. And by the way, he's speaking at our Cleveland, he's coming to Cleveland, he's speaking at our Veg Fest this year, and at the end of the talk, I'll mention our Cleveland Veg Fest that's coming up in May. Let's talk about world hunger. There it is. 6 million children die of starvation every year. 1 billion people are food deprived, or nearly 1 billion people are food deprived. 80% of the world's starving children live in countries where surplus food in the form of feed grain is grown and exported to affluent countries to feed livestock. It's a political issue as well, we know that. But you get the picture. And we who consume animal products are complicit in promoting world hunger by supporting this industry. And again, look at what 1 acre of land can produce. 40,000 pounds of potatoes, 50,000 pounds of tomatoes, and yet only 137 pounds of beef. It's a tremendous waste. These are the practical issues of the impact of animal agriculture, but they greatly relate to so many justice issues, both for humans and for the animals who are victims of it. Even as far back as ancient Greece, people were concerned about a relationship between their animal-based culture, land use, and resource wars. In Plato's Republic, it's dramatized by the dialogue between Socrates and Glaucon. Socrates. And there will be animals of many other kinds if people eat them? Glaucon. Certainly. Socrates. And living in this way, we shall have much greater need of physicians than before? Glaucon. Much greater. Socrates. And the country which is enough to support the original inhabitants will be too small now, and not enough? Glaucon. Quite true. Socrates. Then a slice of our neighbor's land will be wanted for us by pasture and tillage, and they will want a slice of our land, if, like ourselves, they exceed the limit of necessity and give themselves up to the unlimited accumulation of wealth? Glaucon. That, Socrates, will be inevitable. Socrates. And so we shall go to war, Glaucon, shall we not? Glaucon. Most certainly. And I'd like to add 2 lines to this dialogue. Socrates, tell us, Glaucon, how can we avert this terrible future? What in humans' hearts, man or woman, will prevent this? Glaucon, only that part of our hearts which cannot bear to base their sustenance on the murdering of their fellow animals. We want to end wars, yet every day we embark upon an incomprehensibly massive war, enslaving and killing billions of fellow beings. And we're not just talking about the end point of slaughter, at least for land animals. We're talking about beings whose entire lives are spent enslaved from birth to death. Their ear tags driven into them at birth is the only identity they will ever be granted, a number. And their day of death by slaughter is assigned to them on the day they are born. And see the yellow tag? Ten minutes later. Such injustice to our fellow beings has deep roots. And from those roots have grown the branches of our human injustices as well. What goes around does come around. And such massive violence has consequences. What we reap, we sow. What we sow, we reap. We war upon and heap injustices upon our fellow animals and the earth, and it returns to us in wars and injustices against each other. The come around from our exploitation of fellow animals is systemic injustice in the human and non-human world. Massive health issues, a diminishment of our hearts and spirits, and a ravaged earth that is literally screaming, along with the animals, for us to stop our assault on them. So how do we end wars and other injustices once and for all? Certainly never if we fail to become a vegan world. Justice and slaughter can never coexist. And we know what Martin Luther King said. If there is injustice anywhere, there is injustice everywhere. The injustices of slaughterhouses are anywhere. They are anywhere animals are on our plates. And it results in injustices everywhere in the world. But a vegan world just might reverse it all. Imagine a vegan world. A vegan world would usher in a new vision. The daily refusal to participate in the culture of enslavement, domination, exploitation, and murder of our fellow beings would completely change the consciousness of human society. No longer daily ingesting suffering, misery, and death. As a society, we would free ourselves and our spirits from the prison of being the walking graveyards of murdered beings. We would become far more peaceful. The worst impacts of climate change would be averted, buying us the time we need to convert to a carbon-free economy. Our forests, freed from the ravages of animal agriculture, would replenish themselves. Our rivers would run fresh and clean. Our oceans would return to life. Earth's biodiversity would be restored. We would easily have enough food to eliminate world hunger. We would eliminate our epidemic of diseases caused by animal products. We would have a gentler society, one that refuses to dominate and exploit our fellow beings, including fellow humans. Our politicians just might also become gentler. Our policies and laws would serve the 99%. The 1% would just fade away. And 65 billion land animals and 1 trillion fishes a year, actually 8, would be forever thankful. And the good news is, for all these benefits and to end this massive injustice, we don't have to protest, we don't have to petition politicians, or struggle to change laws. We don't have to do anything. All we have to do is not do something. Just not consume animals and their secretions. What could be easier in our fight to bring more justice to the world? So what's vegan got to do with it? Pretty much everything. And you may dismiss everything I'm saying here. I could be wrong that a vegan world would bring peace, but I don't think I'm wrong at all. But that's not the point of my talk anyway. It's not about us and what we can get out of stopping our exploitation of fellow animals, any more than wanting to end the end of human injustices is about what we can gain from it. We all want peace for the sake of peace to others, not for what we gain. It is a giving without expectation of getting. But we all know the benefits of such altruism will return to us tenfold. That's how altruism works. We all know that intuitively. And when we allow that to fully work its magic, we'll have a healthy earth and a healthy society that can finally live in peace. It hasn't done that yet because we haven't yet widened our circle of compassion to include all beings. When we finally do that, we will finally have the peace that we're striving for. So, thank you. Veg Fest. Again, I'm from the Cleveland Vegan Society, and every year we put on the Cleveland Veg Fest. We hold it downtown at the Cleveland Convention Center every year. Some of you have been there, and it's a wonderful. It's a free event all day long. We have a huge vegan food court. We have a huge cruelty-free marketplace. We have speakers all day. We show films. We have a children's court, a children's area, music. It's just a great day to learn more about veganism. And I'm going to turn this over after 30 years. Let me turn this over to Nellie. Take it away now.